Many of us have seen images of a naturalization ceremony in the United States, where a group of individuals become citizens. Or perhaps you have participated in a naturalization ceremony yourself. But did you know that the process to become a citizen used to be quite different? Join us today for a discussion with a research fellow who talks about how a person could go about becoming a citizen of the United States in the 19th century, and who will help us understand why that process was so complex, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the Associate Editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. Those interested in browsing back issues of the Register and reading many of the articles that we talk about here on the podcast should check out Project Muse. Through Project Muse, members of the Kentucky Historical Society are provided with access to past issues dating to 2010. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which supports researcher visits to our campus from around the world. Before we get into today's interview, I'd like to give a shout out to another podcast that recently featured a story from the collections of the Kentucky Historical Society. Scottish and Scared podcast covers all things Scottish and sometimes scary. The host of the show, Stephanie, recently started a new series focused on cursed objects, and she featured the story of our conjured chest. Give her podcast a listen and learn about the folklore of the infamous conjure chest. You can find a link to her podcast in our description. Many Kentucky citizens have ancestral links to Scotland, and our collections reflect those connections. The Alexander family immigrated from Scotland to Virginia in 1786, establishing a huge property in Woodford County, which would later become known as Woodburn Farm, where a systematic method was first developed for horse breeding. Sara Egge is a Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History at Centre College. She holds a Ph.D. in history from Iowa State University. Her first book, Women's Suffrage and Citizenship in the American Midwest, won prizes from the Western Association of Women Historians and the State Historical Society of Iowa. She has articles in the Middle West Review, the Annals of Iowa, and was co-guest editor of the Summer-Autumn 2018 issue of the Register on agriculture and rural life in Kentucky. She is now turning her attention to her second book project, The Nature of Naturalization, Exploring Citizenship by Consent. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be here.
So although we're up to our 13th episode of the podcast, you're the first person we have talked to who teaches in Kentucky. So can you tell us a little bit about your academic background and how you ended up at Centre College?
Well, I am a Midwestern girl, as I say, through and through. I was born in South Dakota. I got my undergraduate degrees from North Dakota, and then I got my PhD from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. So when I thought of ever living anywhere and teaching, I did not think of Kentucky, I have to admit.
Yeah.
But there was a job at Centre College, this small liberal arts institution, and I had really not heard of it, or I wasn't very familiar with it, but the job really fit my academic interests. So the program I attended was called the Agricultural History and Rural Studies program. And so that looked at, obviously, rural life. There's the cultural aspect of that. And then there was also environmental aspects. So part of my job is to teach environmental history at Centre. And then the other part they were looking for was someone who could do another component, either gender or race. And I do gender history because I look at the women's suffrage movement in rural places. So that combination, I think, gave me at least an edge enough to get an on-campus interview, which I did in the spring of 2012. So I've been here now over a decade and really enjoyed it. And then, of course, the idea that I could teach lots of different subjects, that I was really dedicated to the liberal arts, I think that also was really helpful. And so I started at Centre, like I said, in 2012, and I'm still here and enjoying it very much.
Now, just out of curiosity, I'm an outsider. I come from Maryland. I had never heard of Centre College. And then when I got here, one of the first things I did was you start to kind of go about, see the rich history, so many people tied to Centre College. Did you know about the institution at all before you came to Kentucky, or was that sort of something you learned about? Because for me, I know, it's a beautiful, beautiful campus. It looks absolutely lovely.
It is. There's a lot of pride and dedication from our facility staff for the actual campus itself. And then, of course, the rich history, these sort of titans in lots of different fields, these major names that we've heard of in Kentucky history. So many of them have connections to Centre College. either as students and then alumni or faculty staff. There's a strong tie, although it's not so much anymore, but with the Presbyterian Church. So we have lots of Presbyterian or just religious figures from the 19th century, especially. We have a particularly strong tradition with abolitionism, which is, I think, fascinating. So I didn't know that. I had this sort of like, okay, Center College in the middle of the state, small liberal arts, and that was about it. And so then when I got here, I was really blown away by that rich tradition, kind of the fusion of attention to these issues at the time, current issues like slavery, but then also a really strong academic focus. Like, how do we develop the thinking and the skills needed to tackle these pressing issues in the world? And that's something that still animates the mission of Center. How do we have these serious conversations? How do we prepare students, as we say, for lives of leadership, learning, and service, so that they can go off and be the next Supreme Court justices, like John Marshall Harlan, for example. So,
which was cool, because I didn't know a lot, and then I was working on the historical markers, and one of the things we did, we talked about all different folks, and one of them was Harlan, and then I was just amazed, like how many were at Center at some point. So that was fascinating to me.
It is, yeah, and it's really wonderful because then the students come to understand that they are part of this long tradition, and that dedication to those kinds of causes is something that they can also pursue for themselves. So I think it also is part of the story we like to tell.
So switching gears just a little bit, I'll mention your first book. It was Women's Suffrage and Citizenship in the American Midwest. Does your new project build upon this earlier project, or what led you to pursue the topic of naturalization and citizenship? Because we've had a few recent fellows who we've talked to who are embarking on their second project, and I always find it interesting to what extent they overlap, or just to hear about how you sort of got on this topic. Does it build on the first book, or is this something that's just related to something you were interested in and wanted to follow up?
Yeah, so it definitely is something that came out of my first book. The Women's Suffrage and Citizenship was intentional in the title, because so much of what my research was about was the recognition that suffragists in the Midwest framed their argument for the right to vote out of their dedication as citizens, really civic leaders. They called themselves the best citizens because they were the most involved in their communities, building libraries, post offices, schools, churches, institutions. And so as institution builders, that was their main claim to the vote, is that they deserve the right to vote because they best understood how to uplift communities. And so that was really powerful. And so that idea of citizenship was really pressing on me, especially in the Midwest. At the same time that the suffrage organizations are becoming more prominent, you have an influx of immigrants. And these immigrants not only are not citizens, but in many states, because of state law, they have the right to vote before they naturalize. And that was very striking. It was a line of attack that suffragists used against these immigrants to then propel their own claims to the ballot. But it was fascinating to me that in the United States, we had a very prominent practice of giving the ballot to people who were not citizens. I thought that was so wild. And so that led me to apply for an NEH grant, which I received in the spring of 2015, to develop a course at Center about citizenship. And then from that, I have continued to teach it. I'm teaching it right now as a writing intensive course with a focus on citizenship and the development of the both cultural, political, and then legal parameters of it. But then also propelling the second book project, which is a history of naturalization. And the idea there is to really dig in. How does this process work? Who controls it? Who are the gatekeepers? And one of the things I was looking at in particular at the Kentucky Historical Society was the role of local clerks in courts systems. They're the ones that are in charge of the paperwork. In the Naturalization Acts, it explicitly says the clerks must record all of this information. So they have a very powerful role in determining who becomes a citizen. And so I was looking at these court order books. These were books kept by clerks of court to try to figure out, how did this process actually work? So that's what I was doing, and I'm really excited. I've found some fascinating things at the Kentucky Historical Society and other places about, frankly, it's sort of bonkers. What you think, as of course, as so many things, when you put it in the hands of ordinary people and you tell them, go forth and make citizens, maybe they don't understand all the rules, or maybe they make them up for themselves. And so there is this fascinating kind of focus on local politics and local history, which I think is really important. And I think, especially in telling the story of Kentucky, that's really valuable.
I was just amazed at the amount of groundwork you had to do for this particular project. I knew nothing about it, so when we were talking when you were here, it opened up, oh, this is an interesting topic. And then when you were going through the microfilm and spending so much time, I think people sometimes overlook the behind the scenes of being a historian, who you're still kind of following up on those threads and going, okay, what is this idea? But you were finding good stuff, but it was just so interesting, because for me looking at it, I was like, oh, that's a hard thing to do all day, scrolling through those microfilm and going, looking at that.
I did that with newspapers for the women's suffrage book because so few women actually talked about their activism because it was a bit taboo. But the newspapers followed these campaigns, and so that's where I would spend hours reading microfilm copies of newspapers. So for me, I was a little bit used to it. I just the sort of monotony. But for me, the fun of it is the context around the sources I'm trying to find. And so that was really fascinating, just to sort of get the flavor of local politics in the developing state of Kentucky. So reading these court order books, this is where everything that had to happen that needed some sort of legal approval, where you set roads, who's going to pay for the bridges, taverns, like how you're going to put up saloons or taverns. So you get this, like, you follow these stories, and I think that's kind of fun. And it allows me to give the kind of rich context then to explain then what are the ways that people become part of a community. What is this community? Who are the key leaders, and what is the sort of vibe of this place? And I think that's really helpful too. So I think for me, the best part of history is finding these characters, these people who just fascinate you. And the fact that you can really dig into their lives and you don't need their permission. I think that's one of the reasons that I love history.
It's hard not to get distracted, though. That's what always, for me, newspapers especially, you can find so much random rabbit holes to go down. There is a lot. So for our listeners, I am going to explain briefly that when you were at KHS, you were on a commuter fellowship. So it was a slightly different than your sort of typical research fellowship. And we've talked briefly about your sources, but were there any in particular that you found that sort of pointed you in new directions, or that when you were here, I think it was last summer, that sort of shifted how you're approaching this topic moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. One of the major ones that just struck me in the moment was this Bible, this document that somebody had written in this book, and they had written these verses, and it was basically this guy from Lexington who was like, I'm a Kentuckian, but my home is this like kind of regional focus. In other words, the verses were sort of like, the way I see myself as a person in with a national identity is very complicated. Kentucky is my home. We have this growing sense of being an American, but very much the argument for him was, I'm not an American first. I'm a Kentuckian. I'm from Lexington. Like, this is how I understand my loyalty and my affinity is really more closely with the particular community in which I live. And what we find is that totally tracks with the scholarship on naturalization, and especially early Republic period naturalization cases, is that there is not a strong national identity. And so when the federal government is the one calling the shots and saying, when you naturalize to the United States, for a lot of states that had also, before the United States had its constitution, had been naturalizing people, this produces a bit of a tension. Like, what are you actually a citizen of? Are you a citizen of the state, Kentucky or Virginia or Tennessee or whatever? Or are you ultimately a citizen of and loyal to the United States? Which one comes first? Of course, we know this is one of the major questions that animates the Civil War and which side people fall on. And so I think we know that this is something, but to look at this in terms of naturalization is really fascinating, because it gives us this other dimension about how people construct their identities. And we still do this today. I think that's another important point. It's still relevant to think about the way people construct their political partisanship or their loyalties, the way they understand themselves. I think we would look at this and assume, well, I'm an American. That's where my loyalty, that's where my identity comes from. But yet, I live in Danville. and
Right.
that kind of local context, following the Boyle County football team this year, we can all think about things happening that are more apparent in our lives that are local. So it was fascinating to connect. It's actually the local that is primary, not the federal government. So I think that's a really important point.
And I think the kind of building on that, we tend to overlook Kentucky, I think, sometimes as a site of immigration, naturalization, those types of things. I know for me personally, it tends to be okay, I'm thinking, immigration, southwest border, or else New York, or some of these sort of bigger locations where I'm thinking, okay, large communities, this is what's happening. But you're right, Kentucky is a great place to look at.
Absolutely. Kentucky has all of the features within immigration history we often think about. So, the rise of the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti immigrant party in the 19th century. It's got industry in some of these major cities, Louisville,
Mhm.
Covington, these areas, and it tracks lots of immigrants. And so we do overlook it, and I think it's to our detriment. And in fact, I think we not only overlook Kentucky, but we overlook the kind of regional, the mid Atlantic or the southern. And so we don't have a full story of immigration and the ways in which the policies around it, the thinking about it, the nativist or xenophobic arguments that develop, they do intersect with Kentucky history. So I think it's really important. And it's still, again, we rely a lot on immigrants for labor. We have lots of immigrant communities and stories of the importance. So I think, again, it helps us better tell Kentucky's story, both from the past and the present, if we can better understand these elements of it. So I think the contribution I'm hoping to make for Kentucky history is to center the story of immigrants.
I think that's a really important story. As a side note, I didn't realize high school football was such an important thing. High school sports, I should say, in general. I've been learning that, but that is, I mean, the pride surrounding local teams is something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, again, it's a modern day example, but it's one of, again, how do you align yourself and with what teams or causes or whatever? And I think that's still something where we can ask ourselves those questions.
Yeah, even with region and stuff like that. So I know you've talked about this a little bit, but what is the end goal of this particular project? So to give our listeners just a little background, our fellows come into the building, they're doing research. It sort of depends on the length of the project that they're working on. But what is sort of the outcome of this, or what is your goal for all of this coming together?
Yeah. So this spring, I'm very thankful. I have a little bit of a time off from teaching. And
Nice.
so I will be devoting it entirely to writing this second book project. My goal is to be done with it by the end of the spring term. And I've written several chapters. So that's always a good thing, is to have some writing done. And then, of course, continue to write more and then revise, refine. So I'll be doing that this spring. And the goal is to have the monograph out. Would probably come out more likely in 2025. But I think the story of naturalization has really never been told. And then to tell it with this wonderful history of Kentucky and other states, but just to give it that kind of attention is really important. So there will be a book. I'm not quite sure what the title will be yet, something about citizenship and naturalization, but I think it'll be a really important one. And I think especially as we think about these big questions, who belongs, who decides how they belong to these communities. Those are big, broad questions, but naturalization is one way that we have sought to answer that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to some writing time in the most nerdy way possible. I embrace that. Yeah.
It's challenging. I mean, you're on schedule and you're doing a ton of stuff, but that is a hard part. I think people overlook too. Coming up with a title for something can also be way trickier because you kind of go, okay, I've got this, and it sort of fits, but then readers are oh no, don't do that because it doesn't really say the whole story, and then you got to pick something else, and then you're like, oh no. Did you come up with the title for your first book on your own, or was that something that someone suggested along the way?
Yeah, so it was kind of in conversation with my editor of that book. I obviously had to be something with women's suffrage and it was in the Midwest, but I really pushed for citizenship because I wanted to adequately reflect for readers that this was a book that wasn't just about the fight for women to get the right to vote, that it was really a broader examination of the development of those questions. Who's a citizen and by what rules or in what way? And I was really trying to explore that in the book. And so looking at the vilification in some cases of immigrants, especially during World War I, that was a very intense anti-immigrant time. That was really important to me to be telling that history as part of this history of ultimately how women in the Midwest and then in the United States achieved the right to vote with the 19th Amendment.
Such an important story to get out there, too. Shifting gears just a little bit, you mentioned that you have leave time to write next semester, which is great. That's fantastic. But for those who might be unfamiliar, what does a typical semester look like for you? You mentioned one of the classes you were teaching before, but at Center, what do you do there? What sort of classes do you typically teach? What's a typical semester look like in the classroom for you?
Yeah, so today we have started our first day of finals. So the word I have to just that comes to mind right away is what's a typical time? It's intense. But of course, of all days, it is quite intense. So I teach 6 classes a year. And then at Center, we have a fall term, a spring term, and then a January term that we call Center term. And so it kind of varies. Faculty do this differently, but I'll teach either 3 courses in one of the long term and then Center term or January term. So then the other one, I'll teach 2 courses, so 6 total. And it's a mix of upper level courses and then I would say survey level courses or first year or sophomore level courses. So the writing intensive course is only for first years. That's the one I'm teaching on citizenship right now. And I have 2 sections of that. And then I'm teaching this upper level course on American environmental history, which was one of the courses that when I first applied, they indicated they wanted me to teach. So I've taught that almost every other year. So I love that class. It's a really great and important, very timely, but the history of the environment is very complicated and students really find it compelling in a really significant way. They do research papers that look at a particular place on Center's campus. They get to choose. And then they tell that story. How has this place changed or not changed? How has the environment shaped how humans have interacted with that place and then vice versa? So there's some really great, they get to do primary source analysis using the special collections and archives at Center. The Boyle County Library also assists us as well in that. And then they get to do observations. So they get to generate their own primary sources, sort of the reading the landscape and getting a sense of what is this environment on its own terms, as much as we can with our human senses understand it. So it's a really great course. I also teach, though, it's a liberal arts institution. So I teach many different kinds of courses. I do gender and U.S. history. My specialty is the kind of Civil War era through World War II. And that affords me the opportunity to teach military history. So I do courses, one called America in the World Wars. And then I'm very privileged. I have taken students abroad twice, and I'll be going again in January 2024. And we are studying World War II in Europe. And so looking at the first 2 times following the Western Front from D-Day at Normandy all the way to Berlin, which is just remarkable. I could spend all of this time just talking about that course. It's just absolutely phenomenal. But then this January, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to go through the Italian front. And I'm going with 2 colleagues, an art historian and colleague in classics who does Roman history. So we're looking at Italy in war from lots of different chronologies. So we get to study the Romans and Julius Caesar. And then we'll look at how the Allied campaign moved up through Sicily all the way to Rome. And it'll just be it's one of those things where I can't even describe. It's outside the classroom, standing on these battlefields or in these places where these people fought. It's just incredible. So the fact that Center College really emphasizes study abroad, I think over 80% of all of the Center students study abroad at some point, is just remarkable.
It's really cool you get to do kind of the local history of what's in your area and also, okay, what's Europe? I mean, that's a cool kind of divide, but
yeah. Well, what I find so important is to think about how local and global connect. So I'm going to Italy, and in 2016, Kentucky Historical Society and the Oral History Commission funded a project where we interviewed World War II veterans. We interviewed 64 people, and actually we sort of slipped in one woman who was born in Italy and her home was occupied by Nazis during the war. And we discovered her. She was living in Danville. She was older. She had moved to the United States after the war. And so for the first time, she recorded her story of what it was like to be a young woman, young girl, living in this area surrounded by occupying Nazis. And so for me, that was this moment of like, I'm going to go to where she grew up. And I've met her in Danville, Kentucky through my work at Center. That's just unbelievable. Some days I just pinch myself. I'm like, did I really get to do this? Like, oh my gosh. So
Oh,
it's incredible. It's those kinds of things that I live for, that kind of thing, to be able to introduce students to those ideas and talk about these ongoing questions about the parameters, the consequences of war. And so I think that's really important. Yeah.
and the oral histories are so important to sort of preserve that knowledge, passing it down. I mean, it's so much gets lost over time. I know here with a repository like ours, it's always great when we're expanding our collections because you sort of feel like you're passing that down to the next generation, which is cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's my hope, that we can have these oral histories and that we can preserve these stories, because as we know, we're approaching milestones where there are fewer and fewer World War
Yes.
II veterans around. So their stories now can last, and that's important.
So shifting gears just a bit as we kind of bring this to a conclusion, I usually ask what folks who visited Kentucky or came to the Kentucky Historical Society found most surprising about Kentucky. So that's usually my go-to sort of end of the interview question. But since you're at center, I figured that would not be the best question to wrap this up. But as someone who comes from the Midwest, you gave your backstory. What is still something that's surprising to you, maybe culturally a little bit different, or a similarity or something that you've just enjoyed about your time in Kentucky?
Yeah. So I thought about this question a lot because, as someone who's lived in Kentucky for a decade, I was like, oh, what is it? Like, what is the thing that I still come back to? One thing that strikes me so much, and I think in part it's because, as in the Midwest, as it is in Kentucky, place is really
Mm-hmm.
important. I think people in Kentucky really strongly identify through their place, where they're from, their hometown. So if it's Appalachia or if it's Western Kentucky or the bluegrass, like, there is a definitive sense. And it's more than just saying I'm from this place, but it is like in your bones. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how to describe that any better, but for me, that is something that Kentuckians constantly exhibit to me, is just this profound sense of identity through place. And the environment is really part of that. Like, it's not just this kind of, oh yeah, Boyle County or Washington County or whatever, but like the components of that place. What can you find when you go there? What can you experience? I think the experience in Kentucky is really profound to me. And I would just add that that is something that I got to do in a class I taught this past spring. I taught the Civil War for the first time. It
Oh,
was wonderful. Of course, being in Kentucky was a treat, just because we have battles and locations, Camp Nelson, and then the
mm-hmm.
Battle of Perryville in particular, which is not very far away at all from Center College. I had the privilege of asking Stuart Sanders, who also works at the Kentucky Historical Society and one of the leading experts of the Civil War nationally, as well as, of course, locally and in the state. And he brought students out to the Battle of Perryville, and that is one of the highlights for me of that class and of my career, was listening to Stuart Sanders explain the tribulations, the terror, the trauma of this battle, literally standing on that battlefield. And it reinforced this idea that Kentucky really is rooted in these places, these moments, and it still animates that sense of identity and the power of this place over the people who live here. So for me, that's where I sort of land when I think about living here. I really appreciate that. And of course, it doesn't hurt that I'm a historian and I'm aware of these, thinking about these things, but I'm really moved by it. I think it's really important.
What's crazy to me always how you can live so close to something historically important, however we define that, and sort of just ignore it or don't appreciate it. I grew up not that far away from Sharpsburg, so the Battle of Antietam, and I never actually visited it until after I moved away and I came back and was like, oh, I really should go. So I think with like Perryville, I think it's that same dynamic of sometimes even people who grow up here, you might not go, okay, that's such an important site. So to have someone like Stuart who can take you around and show you sort of the importance of that place, but also nationally just how important that battle is, I think that's a fascinating thing. Because sometimes you just don't appreciate it to the full extent.
Yeah. Well, it certainly helps to have Stuart Sanders, who knows all the ins and outs, explain it to you. But it makes you appreciate. You often hear the story of these major moments, the Civil War, and
Mhm.
you think about it in terms of Antietam or Sharpsburg or Gettysburg or Vicksburg. And those are certainly important. But so too is Perryville.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
too is Camp Nelson, right? So too are these other places. And I thought that was such a valuable moment to really get the students and me to really appreciate when we enter into these narratives that complicate our assumptions and what we presume, I mean, it just opens up new ideas and new questions that I still am. I'm so excited to teach that class again. I'm hopeful that Stuart will need to come and give his wonderful expertise again. So
I'm sure he'll be back. He is the expert on that. So it's like, you know, even working with him, it's always great because you can pick his brain, or if a book comes out about it, he'll like, oh, here. So it's always useful. So thank you so much. I know you're busy with finals week and all that's going on, but thank you so much for joining us today. I know I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I did. Thank you so much for having me.
The path to naturalization in the United States has changed over time. One thing that has not changed, however, is that people continue to come to Kentucky hoping to make a better life for themselves and their families, just as they did in the 19th century. We appreciate the work of scholars like Dr. Egge, who are working to tell the story of those who immigrated to Kentucky in the 19th century. Far too often, these stories have not been told. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Sara Egge, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison and edited by Gregory Meyer, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lay. To learn more about our publication of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. That's history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and be sure to tell your friends and colleagues.